Yes, that's what I had. Or at least, as far as I could tell, it really was. My wife Hilly and I tied the proverbial knot nearly 20 years ago. In fact, our 20th anniversary was just a few weeks away on December 10th, and I could honestly say that I wouldn't change much to make our life together any better. Of course, we had our arguments, but making up was always much more enjoyable. That's just the way we were. In our marriage, there was only one truly dark period, and that was in our second year. We both married young. I was 20, and Hilly was just 18, and we had been childhood sweethearts, living just around the corner from each other. My older brother Bob had married her sister Pam a year before, and it seemed like the right thing to do. Our problem was that the other couple had their first child within the first year, while we seemed unable to. We both got tested, although the doctors kept telling us that we were worrying too much and just needed to let it happen naturally. But the problem was Hilly's parents, specifically her mother, who kept nagging us to start a family. Of course, that's how their family was. And besides her sister Pam, Hilly had 3 other sisters. Jen, my mother-in-law, desperately wanted a son since she hadn't been able to have one herself. And of course, Bob and Pam's first child was another girl. The pressure. The test results were rather inconclusive. Hilly was fine, but my sperm count was slightly below normal or something like that. I didn't really understand much. The doctors assured us that there was nothing serious, that everything was fine, and that we just needed to be patient. Their words were that our first child would decide when it was time to arrive. We were patient, but that didn't mean our marriage wasn't under strain. Fortunately, as it turned out, we didn't have to wait too long, and in the 3rd year of our marriage, Hilly gave birth, just as the doctor had promised. Linda, a beautiful little girl in every way, though she was another girl, at least that put our fears to rest about whether we could have a child or not. And from then on, everything calmed down, and our marriage became ideal and continued in that same spirit. Undoubtedly, because we were more relaxed, Hilly soon became pregnant again, and finally, Tom was born. Yes, a boy, and the whole family was over the moon with joy. Don't get the impression that the girls were neglected or loved any less, but the first son in the family just made everything special. Well, I was the first to do it. I boasted to my older brother, but he just smiled at me and told me to give him some time. Well, he got his time, and sure enough, the next year, they had their first son, and wouldn't you know it, 8 months later, we had another one, whom we named Mike. It's just like with buses, isn't it? You wait forever, and then a whole bunch of them arrive at once. Perhaps because there were 2 brothers and 2 sisters among us, we all lived like one big happy family. Even when Hilly's other sisters got married, they were just drawn to it. It was great for the kids, and of course, none of us ever lacked a babysitter when one was needed. As far as I know, the other couples were just as happy as Hilly and I, simply enjoying the wonders of married life when surrounded by a loving family. There were a few other troubles as well, like when Bob had an accident at work, and I practically had to stay by his side while they slowly transfused my blood into him. He got through it, and of course, I didn't suffer from it, often joking brotherly that we were now truly blood brothers. As our 20th anniversary approached, we thought about how to celebrate it. Bob and Pam had celebrated their anniversary the year before, and everyone enjoyed getting together so much that we decided to do something similar and booked a private room at a local hotel for a large gathering of family and friends. By that time, Linda was a very beautiful 17-year-old girl, younger and perhaps even more beautiful than her mother, with luxurious dark chestnut hair and huge green eyes that drew attention whenever she looked your way. They had similar builds, both slender, with beautiful legs and other attributes that perhaps a father shouldn't focus on too much. Naturally, she had a string of boyfriends, and one or another was constantly showing up at the house, but she had a sensible head on her shoulders, so we just went with the flow. Tom, as I always thought, was a bit more like me. He was sturdier, and it suited him. He loved rugby just as much as Bob and I did at his age, and at almost 16, he was already regularly playing as a halfback on his school's first team. And young Mike, the youngest of them all. Well, maybe he was going through a tough time and not being as good at sports as Tom, or, for that matter, as popular as Linda. Poor Mike was having a rough few years. Nothing serious, you understand. He was very smart, possibly even smarter than the other two, and did very well in school. He just behaved like a completely normal, completely incomprehensible teenager. That day, maybe I should have been more understanding that day. Maybe I should have ignored the mess he left on the dining table. Maybe I should have just cleaned it up for him. But did I? No, you're not going out until you clean up this mess, Mike, I said to him firmly. I'll do it later, he responded sullenly. You'll do it now, Mike, I insisted. Why are you always picking on me? He shouted back, losing his temper. I'm not picking on you, I snapped. You're part of this family, and you'll follow the rules just like everyone else. Who's going to make me? Mike nearly cried, truly losing his temper. I will, I retorted, beginning to lose mine. I'm your father, and you'll do what I say. My father? Is that you? He shouted back. Are you sure about that? I suddenly stopped, my next words stuck in my throat, stunned by what he had just said. I'm sorry, Dad. Mike jumped up, his face full of anguish. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to say that. I'll fix it right now. With that, he turned away from me and started gathering the books and other things he had left on the table. Within a few minutes, everything was clean, and he bolted out of the room without saying another word, leaving me alone in my own world, wondering if that world was about to come crashing down on me. The problem, of course, was that Mike was, and always had been, different from the other two. More studious, more serious, but less sociable than his older siblings. I often wondered why he was so different, and even discussed it with Hilly, but she would just shrug and say it was all in my head. Was it? Was I imagining things? What prompted Mike to make that remark? If he had just shouted it in anger and walked away, I would have been mad at him, but that would have been the end of it. But he apologized so quickly and retracted the comment. Why? What did he know that I didn't? Damn it. I really didn't want to think about the thoughts racing through my troubled mind at that moment. My first reaction was to rush to find Hilly and demand to know what she had done. But where would that lead? What would I say? I could hardly just go and accuse her of sleeping with some other guy behind my back. If that were the case, she would just deny it. And if it wasn't, how could she ever forgive me for doubting her? Besides, that was 16 years ago or more. But does that change anything? Is it still going on? My stomach was churning. I felt like I was going to be sick, and I still didn't know if I had any real reason to worry. Oh God, what a terrible day it was. Blood types, that's it, I thought. And without another word, I went to our study and dug through the children's medical records. Linda, Tom, and Mike, all O+, which, after giving blood to my brother, I knew was the same as mine. I felt a wave of relief wash over me until it occurred to me that blood types don't tell the whole story. If Mike had a different blood type, that would have been one thing. But the fact that they all had the same blood type could just be a coincidence and didn't confirm that he was truly my biological son. Oh God, what should I do? DNA. I couldn't believe that thought had crossed my mind. That one careless comment from an angry son had thrown me off balance. I was panicking without good reason. But when Mike couldn't meet my gaze at dinner that evening, throughout the entire meal, I started to worry again. And when he rushed away from the table without saying a word to anyone, I began to worry in earnest. What's wrong with Mike? Hilly asked, having noticed his strange behavior as well. I have no idea, I replied, shrugging. Kids, do you have any thoughts? They both shook their heads, probably not even noticing anything unusual. Was he upset about something? I asked, but they just shook their heads again. After waiting for the two teenagers to leave the table, I gathered the courage to ask my wife a little more. Mike is so different from the other two, Hilly, I began. Any idea why that might be? Oh, let's not go over this again, Davy, she replied, getting up to clear the dishes. He's not that different. He's just a bit deeper than the other two. End of conversation. Was that deliberate, or was she genuinely indifferent to it? I really didn't know. DNA. Why not look into it? And within 20 minutes, I was already Googling online. An hour later, my head was full of facts and figures, but honestly, I didn't feel much smarter. It wasn't until Monday morning that I found the name of the lab that conducted the test. It took me almost an hour to track it down. And no doubt, my secretary could have done it much faster. But how do you explain to your secretary why you need this? Exactly. That's why I decided to do it myself. They could do it. They had no problems with that. But it was expensive, especially if you wanted the results as quickly as I did. But I had to know before risking my marriage, was Mike my son or not? When I told them I had 3 children, they suggested I send in samples from each of them for cross-checking along with one of my own. Have you ever tried to get even a single hair from your grown children? It's not easy, I'll tell you. And considering that Mike kept avoiding me at every opportunity, this was the hardest of all. Nevertheless, I managed, sent them off, and then waited. Now all I could do was wait for the information. Was Mike my son or not? Over the next week, Mike seemed to calm down again, probably relieved that I hadn't brought up his outburst. We almost reached the point where I felt I could gently bring up the subject, but I decided it was better to wait for the results, now that I had gone down this path. My wife, of course, continued to be her usual loving self, and nothing else seemed to change in our routine. I can't say it was the most passionate sex we had during those few days, but I didn't turn it down. Doubts were eating me up inside, and although I tried my best to hide it from Hilly, I just couldn't have sex with her without wondering who else might have been doing it over the 20 years of our marriage. One evening, we were having dinner with my brother and his wife, and when he and I were alone, I almost confessed my fears to him. We were very similar in almost everything, so if someone else was Mike's father, logic suggested it couldn't be him. My God, why did I even think that? Had I really become that paranoid? However, something stopped me. I shouldn't burden him with my doubts, and in the end, I was sure he would be there for me if the results were bad. I stayed calm. I kept quiet. I was so quiet that Hilly asked me a couple of times if everything was all right with me. I'm fine, I told her, just have a few things on my mind. For a moment, she looked concerned but didn't press me further. The results arrived. I asked for them to be delivered to my office just in case Hilly came home before me and opened the letter. I read it with trembling hands, trying to make sense of what it all meant. Could this piece of paper mean the end of my marriage? I read it. As far as I could tell, Mike's results matched mine well enough, and I relaxed, though I still didn't fully understand it. You can probably guess that medical terms are just a blur to me. In fact, the whole report was full of phrases like good match and close match, so it seemed like all of this had been a storm in a teacup. What a damn relief! I felt tears well up in my eyes, and thanked the heavens that I hadn't shared my fears with Hilly. I decided to make it up to her that very evening, maybe invite her out to dinner. And then, rereading the cover letter, which I hadn't paid much attention to before, I saw that the lab wanted me to call them to discuss the results. I figured it was just an excuse to make more money off me, and I wondered if it was worth worrying about. "Hello, this is Davy Jones," I said when the phone was answered. Dr. Hoskins asked me to call them. After giving the woman some information and other details, I was finally connected to the good doctor. "Hello, Mr. Jones," he greeted me. "Have you had a chance to review the results we sent you?" "Yes," I replied confidently. "If I understand correctly, it seems my concerns about my son Mike were unfounded." "Yes, but I'm afraid it's not quite that simple," he blurted out, and it felt like the floor vanished beneath me as I waited for him to shatter my world. "You mean he's not my son?" I muttered in response. That's not the case, Mr. Jones, he continued. The likelihood that he isn't your offspring is less than 1 in a million. I would stake my entire reputation on him being your biological son. So Mike is my real son. I replied with relief. Yes, Mr. Jones. What's the problem then? I continued uncertainly. What else could be wrong? By that time, I was already quite worried because I had read somewhere that a DNA test could reveal genetic diseases and the like. Was Mike sick? Did one of us have something terrible? What was he going to tell me? It's the other 2 samples you sent, the doctor informed me seriously. The ones from your son's brother and sister. Yes. What about them? I asked, beginning to panic. Is something wrong with one of them? Well, it appears that they are only half-siblings to your younger son, Mr. Jones. Half-siblings. I hissed at him. What does that mean, doctor? What are half-siblings? It means, Mr. Jones, he continued, that it is very unlikely you are their biological father. I dropped the phone, and the next thing I remember is coming to, surrounded by a group of my coworkers. Give him some air. I heard someone say as I slowly regained consciousness, struggling to breathe. Are you okay, Davy? Another voice asked, and I nodded, trying to get to my feet. They helped me up, and I found myself sitting in my chair, while people behind me murmured about how hot the office was and how much stress they were all under because of the workload. What nonsense. If only they knew. They had someone drive me home, telling me to take the day off. I was grateful that when I arrived, the house was empty. Hilly was at her part-time job, and the kids were at school. I had to do it. I really didn't want to do it, but I had to. With trembling fingers, I dialed the lab's number again. And after a few moments, I was speaking with the doctor once more, apologizing for cutting off the call earlier. I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, he said. I should have warned you beforehand, but we usually communicate by mail, and it can sometimes be very challenging. I told him I understood, that I was fine, and he reviewed the test results with me again. Mike was undoubtedly mine. Linda and Tom were unlikely to be my children, but the results said that all the matches were good or close. Doctor, I pleaded. Could there be some mistake? If we had only 1 sample, he explained cautiously, we might have asked for another sample for verification. But with 2 samples, it's almost 100% certainty. Those 2 are full siblings, but I'm afraid it's unlikely that you're their father. But you said they were close, I repeated, desperately clinging to the thin thread of hope. What does that mean? Do you have a twin, Mr. Jones? He asked cautiously. Or perhaps a brother? My brother, I exclaimed excitedly. What the hell does he have to do with this? You have to draw your own conclusions, Mr. Jones, the doctor continued. If you could obtain a sample from your brother, we could conduct a verification. But I was no longer listening. My little perfect world had truly come to an abrupt end. What was I supposed to do? Did I want to end my marriage? Did I want to cut ties with my only brother? You can divorce your wife, but you certainly can't divorce your brother. Maybe it would be better to continue living as if I knew nothing. To go on living a miserable lie. I couldn't. In any case, what about Mike? He knew something, that much was clear, but it seemed like he had the wrong idea. Of course, from now on, I would see my son Mike in a different light. But would I love Linda and Tom any less? I couldn't imagine that I would. How could I? They were my children, whether I created them or not, and no piece of paper could change that. But what about Hilly? That was the big question. What to do with that cheating? And my bastard brother, for that matter. And Pam, my sister-in-law. What about her? How would she take the news? How would the rest of the family react? Too many questions were spinning around in my head. Oh God, it was all so complicated, and I didn't feel ready for this ordeal. I remember walking out the front door and starting down the street, but the next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital with bandages on my arms. I had stumbled in front of a car, drunk out of my mind, but I didn't know that at the time. "Davy, are you okay?" I turned to see who asked the question, but it hurt. It hurt like hell. It dawned on me that it was my wife. No, not my ex-wife. Not yet. Anyway, speaking to me, she was still my wife. I didn't say anything, at least nothing significant. I just didn't know what to say. How about, "Hi, darling. I just found out that the 2 kids aren't mine, and that you're sleeping with my brother. Did you have a good day? What's for dinner?" Doesn't quite sound right, does it? In any case, it turned out my injuries weren't life-threatening, and the next day, they sent me home. However, I couldn't do anything to help myself, so I was forced to rely on Hilly for assistance. This gave me time to think, time to plan. But that time was wasted, and I still didn't know what to do. Somehow, though, Mike and the other 2 kids seemed like the main issue. Whatever I decided, it had to be in their best interests, even if my own had to suffer. From now on, Hilly's interests would come last. All I knew was that our 20th wedding anniversary was approaching, and the room for the big dinner had been booked. By then, everything needed to be resolved. Within a week or so, I more or less recovered, at least physically, and everything seemed to return to normal as I figured out what to do, except for Mike, who seemed on the verge of going off the rails and was just at the age to do so. "You'll have to talk to him, Davy," Hilly said one late evening. "I don't know what's wrong with him. It seems like he doesn't want to talk to me anymore." "I'll talk to him," I promised. "Do you have any idea what's bothering him?" she asked. "I do. A few ideas," I replied curtly. "Do you want to discuss them with me, Davy?" "Not really," I answered, which left her somewhat disconcerted. The opportunity arose the next day when I found him alone in his room, and unless he shoved me out of the way, he wouldn't be able to avoid me. "Want to talk about what's bothering you, son?" I began gently. He just shook his head. He didn't want to talk. "Maybe it's something to do with that day, Mike." I nudged him. "You know, about our relationship." Mike looked at me, and I couldn't help but notice a tear in his eye. Suddenly, he seemed older than his tender years. "You don't know, Dad, do you?" he challenged me. "I might know more than you think, son," I replied, trying to keep a smile on my face. "Then why don't you do something about it, Dad?" he whined. "Why do you let them get away with it?" Wait, this wasn't going as I thought. It didn't seem like we were talking about the same thing. "Get away with what, son?" What the hell else could I say? "You really don't know, Dad," he repeated. "Apparently not, son," I had to admit. "It's Mom and Uncle Tim, Dad," he told me, barely above a whisper. "When you're at work, about once a month or so. It's a damn shame. Uncle Tim. Damn it, Tim was the husband of Anne, another one of Hilly's damn sisters. Oh, that," I mumbled pathetically, not knowing what else to say. "They've been doing it for years, Dad," my son informed me. "Linda thinks I'm Tim's son, not yours." At that he broke down and cried, and I wrapped my arms around him to comfort him. It had been a long time since I'd done that, and I was surprised by how big and strong my little boy felt. "I can absolutely guarantee you, Mike," I comforted him, still holding him close. "You are my son in every way, not Tim's." "How do you know, Dad?" He sobbed. "How can you be sure?" "I'm sure, son," I told him firmly. "Trust me. I'm sure." We talked a bit more, and without revealing too much, I convinced him of my paternity, and it seemed like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. However, there was no mention of my brother being the father of the other 2 children, and I found that my perfect family wasn't as happy and content as I had believed. Both Linda and Tom knew about their mother's affair with their uncle, but not knowing what to do about it, they chose to simply turn a blind eye. What a terrible position to put your own children in. But Tim, God, his wife was the youngest of the 4 sisters, and without a doubt, the most beautiful of them. Hilly was attractive enough, but Anne. Another blow struck at the heart of my so-called perfect marriage with Hilly. A few days later, I invited all 3 kids to lunch and did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I told them, Told them everything I had learned. Every damn thing. I had no idea how they would react, but they took it better than I expected. Linda cried a little, and Tom sat with his head in his hands. All three wanted to go straight to their mother and confront her, but I convinced them to wait, as I needed to take care of some things first. All three swore their love and loyalty to me, and were close to vowing never to see Hilly again. Of course, I talked them out of that, reminding them that no matter what she had done, she was still their mother and had taken good care of them all their lives. I spoke of her in terms that I didn't actually feel, especially after the kids told me their side of the story. Hilly, my loving wife, had obviously been having an affair with her brother-in-law Tim for some time, but likely not long enough for him to be Mike's father. Once a month might have been a big exaggeration, but honestly, none of us knew for sure. The only thing I knew was that the kids were so grateful to have been told the truth, and all three of them cried, even Tom, when we gathered together at the end of the evening. Let me correct that last statement. All four of us cried. Revenge. I needed to get revenge, but in a way that wouldn't cause my children any pain. And yes, I use that term carefully. I mean my children. I thought long and hard, but I couldn't come up with any grand act of revenge. It had to be just a straightforward confrontation. At least I had an event where I could do it. December 10th. The family gathered, as families do. My parents had passed away by that time, and Bob and I had been fairly late-born children. That evening at the anniversary dinner, there were 39 of us, mostly Hilly's family and their families, but there were other friends of ours as well. The dinner was good. At least, that's what they told me. But as for me, I could have been eating cardboard and drinking water. Time for speeches. It began. The end. Time for speeches. It began. The end. Maybe the beginning. I was sweating profusely and taking long, deep breaths to calm myself. What I was about to do wasn't easy, but it had to be done. Welcome to all our family and friends, I began. And for a few moments, I continued speaking about trivial matters. And now, let's celebrate 20 years of marriage with my wife, Hilly, I finally concluded. There are some very interesting, even intimate and personal things about my marriage to my dear wife that I want to share with you all. There were chuckles around the table, and one or two crude comments about our supposed sex life. Hilly blushed. They all thought I was joking, but how wrong they were. As the laughter died down, Linda was the first to rise from her seat and head toward the exit of the dining room, followed by Tom, and then Mike. They didn't say a word to anyone, and the entire table watched their backs in astonishment, not understanding what was happening. "You three, get back here," Hilly shouted angrily, jumping to her feet. "Don't be so rude to your father." Only Tom responded, turning briefly to look at his mother and shake his head in disapproval before joining his brother and sister outside. "Davy," my wife called out to me, "do something. Tell them to come back immediately." "It's all right, dear," I said to her very firmly. "They already know what I'm about to say, and since it concerns the three of them, maybe it's better if they're not here." Hilly's mouth fell open in shock. At first, she was surprised by how I responded to her demand, and then by the growing concern as her mind must have raced through all the possible reasons for my behavior. "Sit down, Hilly," I told her, my tone leaving no doubt that I was not to be trifled with. As I was saying, I continued, looking at the people around me. I've had 20 wonderful years of marriage, a perfect marriage, or so I thought until a couple of weeks ago. I paused for effect, and the atmosphere around the table became charged with tension. Some looked confused, others still smiled, expecting a joke, but a few were clearly very worried, which surprised me. Imagine my surprise. I went on when no one spoke, to find out that Linda, my beloved Linda, isn't actually my biological daughter. "Oh God," Hilly quietly sobbed, covering her face with her hands, the only one to make a sound. "Would you like to tell everyone who Linda's real father is, Hilly?" I asked her, but she remained silent, only sobbing loudly, the only sound breaking the complete silence around me. All right then, I continued. Does anyone else want to tell everyone who Linda's father is? Does anyone else want to tell everyone who's been sleeping with my wife behind my back? No one spoke, and I just stood there, glaring angrily at the relatives and friends around me. As horrible as it was, in some strange sense, I took a twisted pleasure in taunting the people who had deceived me. None of them knew how much I had uncovered. I couldn't resist throwing a particularly harsh look at my brother Bob, and he noticeably wilted under my gaze, realizing that the game was over. So no one is going to confess. I asked them, do I have to tell everyone who it is? Then, to my surprise, Bob's wife, Pam, jumped to her feet. It's not what you think, Davy, she cried in anguish. It wasn't some sordid affair or anything like that. It was just sex a few times to get Hilly pregnant. The whole family was desperate for a boy, especially Mother, and you didn't seem able to father a child. If anyone had hit me with the proverbial feather at that moment, I surely would have been knocked over, just like that. She knew. She damn well knew. Pam knew that her husband, my brother, was the father of my daughter. I looked around the table and saw that it had divided into two camps. Friends who didn't know and family who, for the most part, seemed to know. As I stood there trying to gather myself, one by one, the friends stood up, made excuses, and awkwardly left, leaving about 17 or 18 of us, all family members. Go and play over there, said Julie, one of Hilly's sisters, and one by one, the younger children were led away. The teenagers were also asked to leave, but this was like a cross between EastEnders, Coronation Street, and Neighbors all rolled into one, and not one of them budged. Fair enough. You all damn well knew, didn't you? I exclaimed, looking around. You all knew about this damned fiasco, except maybe the kids. A couple of the husbands looked a bit confused, but otherwise, no one denied it. Listen, Davy, my brother said. It's not what it seems, honestly. He wanted to add another stupid comment, but my hate-filled glare made him shut up. So you all knew that Bob was having sex with my loving wife, and was Linda's father? I demanded of those sitting at the table. No one said yes, but again, no one denied it either. It was only 3 times, Davy. Pam spoke up again, just enough for her to get pregnant. Whose damn idea was it? I shouted at them, my temper beginning to flare. Again, no one said anything, but far too many glances were directed at Jen, my mother-in-law. I could have guessed. Thanks, Mom, I said to her solemnly. Your desperate desire to have a son in the family cost me my marriage. No, Hilly cried out, finally deciding to participate. Please don't say that, Davy. You can't say that. I couldn't live without you. Surely you can forgive me for just one mistake. One mistake. I asked her. Just one mistake. Of course, darling, Hilly sobbed. It was just that one time. It seems terrible now. But when Mom planned all this many years ago, it seemed logical. And what about Tom? Of course, he's yours, Davy, she whimpered. What do you mean? Wrong. I told her. I had a DNA test done, and his father is the same man who fathered Linda. The atmosphere at the table immediately shifted. What are you saying, Davy? Pam exclaimed in shock. You heard me, Pam, I said to her. If my ever-loving brother is Linda's father, then he's also Tom's father. Silence. This information was clearly new to everyone at the table, or at least to most of them. You're a bastard, Bob. Pam turned to her husband when the realization came. You promised me. You promised me. And then you went back to that. You promised me. And then you went back to that. Bob just hung his head, wishing he could be anywhere else. And you witch, shouted Pam at Hilly. I agreed to let you have my husband for just 1 week, and you kept sleeping with him. With that, she took 3 steps toward her sister and slapped Hilly across the face with all her might. Idiot crap. Blood-sucking cow. She cursed at Hilly, hitting her over and over, stopping and breaking into sobs only when one of the others pulled her away from her younger sister. Happy now, Jen? I spat at Jen, but all she did was stare blankly at me. "So who else has been sleeping with my wife behind my back?" I asked, when no one else spoke, looking directly at Tim, who was sitting on the opposite side of the table from me. "You bastard!" Julie screamed next to me. That caught me off guard too. "So it's true what they told me that night, isn't it, you bastard? You actually slept with her that night at the party." "Whoa, what's going on here?" Julie was yelling at her husband, Ted, who looked like a lamb, not denying a thing. "And you, my dear sister," she shouted at my wife. "Did you sleep with all the brothers?" "Well, she definitely screwed Tim," I added sincerely, actually starting to enjoy the whole show. What? I didn't. Tim wasn't even good at lying, and wasn't very quick that evening, failing to dodge his wife and fist as she punched him in the nose. "Don't come back to our house tonight," Anne yelled at her husband. And in fact, never come back. "That goes for you too," Pam told Bob. "I'm divorcing you, and I never want to see you again." The three scorned sisters linked arms and headed for the door. "You're no sister of ours," they shouted in Hilly's face as they stormed out. "Are you happy now, Jen?" I asked my mother-in-law, but her expression didn't change. She just sat there staring straight ahead, while Hilly continued sobbing in her arms. "I'm sorry, Davy," my father-in-law, Ulf, finally interjected. "If I had known." He trailed off, lost for words, but he was the only one among these bastards who made any effort to apologize. Then my brother Bob walked around the table and approached me, extending his hands with a look of utter shame on his face. "Davy," he stammered. "Davy, what can I say?" "Nothing, you bastard." I spat back, and with little force, I swung at him, landing a punch square on his chin. Maybe it wasn't strong, but the timing was perfect, and he stumbled back, tripping over a chair and sprawling on the floor, not in a hurry to get up. I guess you could say that at that moment, the party was over. It seemed like the fun had drained out of the whole evening. That night, Hilly never came home, and aside from coming to collect a few things, she never returned home again. The kids refused to speak to her for some time afterward, but no matter how much I hated her, I had to think about the long-term well-being of the children. Eventually, they came around and let her back into their lives, but it was never the same. I was their dad, and I guess she became more like a favorite aunt. The whole family fell apart. 2 of the 3 sisters who left that night got divorced, and only Pam stayed with Bob, though she gave him hell, deciding that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Pam came by a couple of evenings later when the kids weren't home, and it quickly became clear what was on her mind. Whether it was revenge for her or revenge on me, I never found out, but I got my comeuppance. There was no love or compassion. We just had sex like rabbits for hours. It was strange, just like sex with my wife, but different. Afterward, she thanked me and left, and it wasn't until a few months later that I found out she had made it a habit, slowly working her way through Bob's friends until she had slept with nearly all of them. Would their marriage survive? I didn't know, and I didn't care. It wasn't my problem. But it must have been a damn shame for that damn brother of mine. 3 weeks later, one of the sisters and the pretty one called me and invited me to dinner. I went. We ate, talked, got romantic, kissed, and eventually ended up in bed. But this time, it was different, and after the initial passion, we made love, and it felt like the early days with Hilly all over again. I don't know why Tim neglected his marriage, but it certainly wasn't because of Anne's lack of sexual appetite. The sweetest revenge, perhaps, was when Ulf, the long-suffering husband of my ex-mother-in-law Jen, decided he'd had enough of her meddling, bought a 40-foot yacht, and spent the rest of his active life sailing around Europe. It paid off. Ian, and sometimes the kids, spent a week or 2 sailing with him. Places like the south of France, La Rochelle, and the Canary Islands became familiar to us. Linda met and eventually married a young Spaniard she met during one of our sailing trips. His family owns what might be the largest marina in Europe, and that came in handy too. The two boys are still out there, playing the field, perhaps wary of marrying too early, as their father did. They've got time. And me. I don't see Hilly, but the kids tell me she's living day to day and often asks about me. The kids tell me, and I just grumble. Oh, and I'm considering giving the idea of a perfect marriage another shot, but this time with Anne. I think we love each other, but we're both still a bit cautious. We'll see. I want to be sure I'm not marrying just to spite Hilly, but I would love to see her face if it happened. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.